The chessboard you have played on your entire life, the one sitting in a cupboard at your parents' house, the one on your phone, is not a game board. According to research published by a scholar writing under the name An Unknown Soldier, it is a surviving, legible fragment of an archaic political document, one that encoded land ownership, gender domains, and the order of governance in alternating black and white squares. And that is just the colour. Today, we are examining chromatic protocols in iconographic writing, specifically what colour meant inside a visual language used globally before 1500 BC, why almost none of that colour has survived, and what this prospective but already remarkable body of research tells us about the way our most remote ancestors modulated meaning through pigment. By the end of this episode, you will understand why colour in the archaic was not decoration but grammar, and why losing it to oxidation and decay is not merely a conservation problem, it is a linguistic catastrophe. I am joined today by someone who has spent considerable time inside this research, and I want to go straight to the heart of it. Let us begin with the writing system itself, because before we can talk about what colour did inside it...
Right, so the starting point is this. Iconographic writing, as the research describes it, is a visual writing system, and that distinction matters enormously. It does not modulate verbal information the way alphabets or syllabaries do. It modulates visual information. The rules of syntax require what the author calls an index, a cartographic boundary, to form the primary container for every composition. Inside that boundary, icons document the principal institutions and leadership modes of archaic realms. So every composition is, in effect, a constitutional document. It describes the structure and function of a society.
And the author, An Unknown Soldier, claims this system was in use on every continent except Antarctica prior to 1500 BC.
That is precisely what the research states. The geographical breadth is described as global, and the chronological depth is, frankly, staggering. The research traces the iconographic record back to 77,000 BC, following the Toba eruption in Indonesia. Now, the author is careful to frame this as a prospective analysis, not a conclusive statement. But the maps being deciphered are offered as evidence, and the author invites readers to let their eyes be the judge.
So where does colour enter this system? Because that is what this episode is really about, the chromatic protocols.
Color enters as a modifier. The research is explicit on this point. Color functioned as an adjective within the visual language. It was not decorative, it was semantic. It carried specific codified meaning. And the thesis of this particular paper, the one on chromatic protocols, is that although the author's research is still in the prospective phase, it is already clear that color served as a modifier in the same way an adjective modifies a noun in a verbal system.
That is a genuinely striking reframing, because when most of us look at ancient artifacts, in a museum, say, we tend to think of color as aesthetic, as decoration, as style.
And that is precisely the blind spot the research is identifying. Modern scholarship has consistently treated color in ancient artifacts as aesthetic rather than semantic, which means the field has been asking the wrong questions for generations. If color was grammar, then every time a conservator notes that pigment has degraded on an artifact, what they are actually recording is the loss of grammatical information. The adjectives have been erased from the sentence.
That is a remarkable way to put it. The adjectives have been erased.
And the research is candid about the scale of that problem. Little, if any, pigment survives from the archaic period, and what does survive is oxidized and degraded. The author frames this episode of the research, the Chromatic Protocols paper, as seeding the necessary research, not concluding it. It is an alert to researchers. Here is what we can determine so far. Here is what we are almost certainly missing. Go and look.
So let us talk about what can be determined. What does the research actually tell us about the meaning of specific colours in the archaic iconographic system?
The clearest surviving example, and the research leans on this heavily, is the black and white protocol. And the entry point into understanding it is, of all things, chess.
Right, which brings us back to that opening provocation, the chessboard.
Chess is described in the research as the perfect metaphor for how chromatic protocols operated in archaic realms. The game is called the Game of Kings because it was used in ancient Persia and in nearly every royal court west of Persia to train princes to rule. But the research goes much further than that familiar history. It argues that the chessboard itself, the alternating black and white squares, is a surviving, legible fragment of an archaic chromatic protocol governing political geography.
Meaning the squares are not just squares.
Each square is a dominion, a political jurisdiction. The research describes them as regions. One could think of them as states, or counties within a state, or towns within a county. And the chromatic distinction between them is not arbitrary. Black squares designated regions as fatherlands. White squares designated regions as motherlands.
Wait, so the color of a square on a chessboard was encoding a legal and political category about the land it represented?
That is the argument. And the logic behind it is elegant. The research explains that designating neighboring dominions, male and female, respectively, introduced a rule everyone has known since birth. Only fathers and mothers can have children. So if only a black and a white dominion acting together could establish a new dominion within the realm, then agreements had to be concluded before any new territory would be recognized by the Realm Council. It was a conflict prevention mechanism encoded in color.
So the Chromatic protocol was doing political work. It was not just describing the world, it was regulating behavior within it.
Precisely. And that is what makes the loss of pigment so consequential. If we cannot read the color, we cannot read the regulation. We are looking at a legal document with the operative clauses missing.
Now, the research also draws on the Asian yin-yang model as a parallel. Can you walk us through that connection?
Yes, and it is important because it suggests the black and white protocol was not isolated to one region. It was widespread. In Asia's yin-yang model of metaphysics, the research notes, black was the masculine energy in creation, and white was the feminine energy. One without the other was incapable of creating anything, but alternating cycles of the two worked what the research calls miracles. And crucially, black came first, followed by white.
And that sequence, black first, white second, that is not incidental. That is the order of precedence.
Exactly. The research is very specific on this point. Black and white was the protocol adopted not to identify us versus them, not good versus evil, but to establish the order of precedence and the order of deference in the administration of justice. That is a fundamentally different function from what most people assume when they see a black and white binary.
Which is interesting because our instinct, and I think this is a very modern instinct, is to read black and white as a moral binary. Good and bad, light and dark in the metaphorical sense.
And the research pushes back on that directly. The chess metaphor is used to illustrate why. A young prince first learns chess as a game about opposing armies, good guys and bad guys. But as his education matures, the tutor reveals that the entire board, not just half, represents the realm. The two opposing sides are not enemies. They are interlocutors in a debate being held within the realm. The chromatic distinction is about sequence and deference, not moral judgment.
That is a genuinely counterintuitive reading of something most of us have grown up with. And it raises a question I want to come back to. But first, let us talk about the discovery itself. Because the research did not begin with chess. It began with a stone in Wales.
It did. The author's discovery began in 2011 in Cardiff, Wales, when he deciphered what is called the Bryn Celli Thi pattern stone in the National Museum of Wales. This stone was discovered buried beneath a mound on the Isle of Anglesey in 1929. In archaeological contexts, radiocarbon dated to 3500 BC. The author's analysis of that single artifact exceeds 200 pages.
200 pages from one stone.
Which tells you something about the density of information the research believes is encoded in these compositions. From Wales, the research extended to Iberia, specifically to the Dama de Elche, a carving dated to 400 BC. Once believed to be a funerary urn imported by a Carthaginian tribal chief, the research reveals it to be a composition based on cartography. The profile of the Dama de Elche, placed next to a satellite image of Spain and Portugal in isolation, is described as nearly irrefutable.
And from there, the research moved to Egypt.
To Egyptian hieroglyphics, yes. The research identifies what it calls the morphological interface between iconographic writing and pictographic writing in Egyptian hieroglyphics. Each Egyptian god, the research argues, is a bust depicting regional geology of Africa in anamorphic similes. The head of the king was always depicted as the geological feature that defined his kingdom. If your kingdom looked like a pin-tailed duck, the head of your king was depicted as a man with a pin-tailed duck's head.
Which suddenly makes the entire Egyptian pantheon legible in a completely different way.
That is the implication. And the research uses Horus as the primary example, the geology of Egypt west of the Nile resembling a perched Egyptian black kite, facing east, wings tucked, claws clutching the upper Nile. The Great Pyramids of Giza are situated precisely on what the research identifies as the nose of Horus in the iconographic composition, the sovereign's mountain. The research notes that Egypt's nobility, lacking appreciable natural mountains, built them instead.
That is an extraordinary claim. And I imagine it is one that will generate significant debate in academic circles.
The author anticipates that. The research is explicit that academic consensus can be, in the author's words, recklessly restrictive. But the invitation is always the same. Open Google Earth, turn off all borders and labels, and look at the geology. The research asks you to let your eyes be the judge before you let consensus be your guide.
Now, I want to return to the chromatic protocol specifically, because I think there is a layer here we have not fully unpacked yet. The relationship between color and the order of deference in archaic governance. The research describes a very specific political architecture. Can you walk us through how color mapped onto that architecture?
This is where the chess metaphor becomes genuinely illuminating, rather than merely illustrative. The research describes archaic realms as being structured around what it calls ruling triads, 3 dominions composing every ruling court. And within that structure, the order of deference was centrical, not hierarchical in the modern sense. The organizational charts of archaic realms mirrored what the research calls the divine order observed in creation.
And color was the marker that told you where you were in that order.
Color was the adjective that modified your position. The research describes how, in the chess metaphor, the prince first plays black, always black, because the prince is first required to defend the realm. He is too young and too inexperienced to be entrusted with offensive strategy. Black, in this context, is the defensive, foundational, precedent-setting color. White comes second, it carries the initiative. And the research asks a genuinely interesting question. If black came first, why does white go first in chess?
And what is the answer?
The author is candid that he cannot answer that question accurately given the limited dataset studied so far. But in the case of the British Isles, the research points to the Morrigan, the grandmother of the realm in pre-Roman Brythonic and Gaelic legend. The Morrigan held the war powers of the realm. She was the elder sovereign in the feminine domain. And chess, as a metaphor for war, begins on the initiative of the elder maternal council. Once the Morrigan decides to go to war, the pieces are set in motion.
So white moving first in chess is not a neutral convention. It is encoding the Morrigan's prerogative.
That is the argument. And it is a striking one because it means the color white, in this specific chromatic protocol, carries the authority of the elder feminine domain. Not weakness, not secondary status, the authority to initiate. The research is careful to note that the Morrigan's authority was not exclusive. All councils of the realm were involved in the decision to go to war. The Morrigan was a safety valve, but she held the prerogative of the final blessing.
I want to pause on that for a moment because I think it challenges a very common assumption about archaic societies, that they were uniformly patriarchal in the modern sense of that word.
The research addresses this directly, and it is one of the more nuanced aspects of the Chromatic Protocols paper. The ruling triad described in the research, the Morrigan, Rigan, and Rhiannon, representing grandmother, mother, and daughter, encoded a governance structure in which the female domain held specific codified authority, not subordinate authority, specific authority. The Morrigan alone possessed the authority to bless a decision to go to war. That is not a ceremonial role. That is a constitutional one.
And that constitutional role was encoded in color.
In the chromatic protocol, yes. White, moving first, encodes that authority. And the alternating squares of the chessboard encode the political geography of a realm in which fatherlands and motherlands were legally distinct categories, each with different rights and obligations in relation to the expansion of the realm.
Now, I want to bring in the broader scope of the research here because I think it is important for listeners to understand the scale of what is being proposed. The author describes a writing system in use on every continent before 1500 BC. The research traces the iconographic record back to 77,000 BC, and yet almost no pigment survives. How does the research propose to move forward given that constraint?
The author is remarkably honest about this. The research notes that in the British Isles alone, there are over 3 million artifacts in the national collections of England, Wales, Ireland, Scotland, and the Isle of Man. If 5 minutes were devoted to each artifact, just 5 minutes, it would require 150 years of continuous work to complete a first pass. The scope of the discovery, as the author puts it, requires the dedicated efforts of a generation to complete.
A generation. That is a genuinely humbling framing.
And it is why the Chromatic Protocols paper is framed as seeding the research rather than concluding it. The author is not claiming to have cataloged the full meaning of every color in the iconographic system. The claim is more specific and more honest than that. Color functioned as a modifier. The black and white protocol is the clearest surviving example, and the degradation of pigment across the archaic record means we are working with sentences that have lost their adjectives. The task now is to recover as many of those adjectives as possible before more are lost.
And that task is complicated by the fact that, as you noted earlier, scholarship has not been looking for semantic content in color, it has been looking for aesthetic content.
Which is the deeper problem. It is not just that the pigment has degraded. It is that even where pigment survives, the interpretive framework has not been in place to read it correctly. The research is proposing a new framework, one in which color is treated as grammatical information, not decorative information. And once you adopt that framework, the questions you ask of an artifact change entirely.
Let me ask you about one specific aspect of the research that I find particularly compelling, the idea that the cartographic basis of iconographic writing was itself a kind of information technology. The research describes a process called soloromancy, using a star from the sun to produce accurate maps. Can you explain how that connects to the chromatic question?
The connection is foundational. The research describes soloromancy as the technical process by which archaic scribes documented the contours of their regions with what the author calls amazing accuracy. More accurate, he claims, than modern GPS satellites. The process involves placing a staff upright, marking the tip of its shadow at 2 points during the day, drawing a line between those points to establish a perfect east-west line, and then using that line as a frame of reference to measure azimuths to distant landmarks.
And Moses is the example the research uses.
Moses on Mount Sinai, or more precisely, on what the research identifies as Mount Catherine, the tallest peak in the region. The research argues that Moses spent 40 years surveying the kingdom of Midian through soloromancy, and that the burning bush of Exodus is the phonetic record of what was, in the iconographic system, a cartographic composition, the contours of the wadis forming the central trunk of the Sinai Peninsula, rendered as a visual document on Moses' robes.
That is a reading of a canonical religious text that I suspect will generate considerable controversy.
The author anticipates that too. The research notes that Islamic, Judaic, and Christian scholars will all argue against the conclusion, but the invitation remains the same. Open Google Earth, find the peak of Mount Catherine, and follow the process. The research asks you to confirm the argument to your own satisfaction before accepting or rejecting it.
Now, the connection to color here, to the chromatic protocols, is that the robes of soloromancers were themselves information technology. The research describes Arabian regalia as wearable data.
This is one of the more fascinating tangents in the research. The gold border adorning the robes of the Arabian nobility, the bisht, is described as representing the line of solar progress. When the robe is worn, the line of solar progress forms an arc around the wearer's head. When laid flat on the ground like a prayer rug, it forms a perfect east-west line. The agal, the rope headdress, is described as a compass complete with azimuth indicators. The research argues that dressed in nothing more than a bisht and agal, the Arabian nobility were never lost.
So color and pattern in the regalia were not ceremonial, they were navigational and constitutional simultaneously.
That is the argument, and it extends the chromatic question beyond pigment on stone artifacts into textiles, into woven rugs, into embroidered tack. The research suggests that secrets were recorded on the underside of rugs, disguised as finishing knots. The permanent designs of Bedouin regalia encoded the colors, arms, and locations of every kindred court along the Bedouin progress. Color, in this context, was not just an adjective, it was an address.
An address. I like that. Color as a locator within a system.
And that is precisely why the degradation of pigment is so consequential. If color was an address, then losing the color means losing the location. You have the document, but you cannot find the place it is describing. The research is asking scholars to treat every surviving fragment of pigment as a potential address, and to develop the interpretive tools to read it.
I want to come back to the chess metaphor one more time, because I think there is a dimension of it we have not fully explored, the pedagogical dimension. The research describes in considerable detail how princes were trained through chess, and that training was, in effect, training in chromatic protocol.
The prince's education in chess is described in the research as a multi-stage process that lasted years, sometimes many years. The prince first learned chess as a game about opposing armies, then as a metaphor for the realm, then as a rhetorical exercise. And at each stage, the chromatic distinction between black and white carried a different layer of meaning. Black first as defense, white as initiative, the alternating squares as a political geography, the pieces as stations in the order of deference.
And the prince was not told all of this at once.
The research makes a point of this. The tutor waited for the prince to form the question before teaching the lesson. An observant prince would ask why the squares alternated from black to white. The research describes this as a litmus test. Only an observant and inquiring prince would bother asking about the distinction being made. And the research adds, with some wry humor, that most of us have never asked that question until now.
Which is a rather pointed observation about how we engage with the world around us.
It is, and it is one of the more quietly provocative aspects of the research. The argument is not just that scholars have missed something, it is that all of us, every person who has ever played chess without asking why the squares alternate, have been sitting in front of a surviving fragment of a global information technology and treating it as a game. The Chromatic protocol was hiding in plain sight.
Hiding in plain sight. That phrase keeps coming back to me as I read through this research. The Dama de Elche hiding a map of Spain in plain sight. The Egyptian pantheon hiding regional geology in plain sight. The chessboard hiding a political constitution in plain sight.
And the research suggests this was not accidental. The iconographic writing system was designed to be legible to those trained to read it and opaque to those who were not. The prince who asked why the squares alternated was demonstrating the character trait of an excellent ruler. The prince who did not ask was demonstrating something else. The system was, in a sense, self-selecting for the observant.
Which raises a question I find genuinely difficult to answer. If this system was so widespread, so sophisticated, so deeply embedded in governance and geography and pedagogy, how did it fade from memory? The research asks this question too.
And the author is honest that he does not have a definitive answer. The research proposes that sometime between 2000 BC and 1200 BC, with the author's preferred marker at 1800 BC, a dramatic shift took place. The author describes it as a period of civilizational stress, possibly collapse, possibly the breakdown of an international diplomatic system under its own weight. But the author is careful to say, it is far too early in the process to trust intuition on this. The maps being deciphered will, the research suggests, resolve many of the questions that currently form academic consensus.
And in the meantime, the Chromatic Protocols paper is asking researchers to treat color as a priority, to look at every surviving fragment of pigment with new eyes.
With new questions, more precisely. Not just what color is this, but what is this color modifying? What is the noun it is attached to? What is the political, geographical, or constitutional category it is encoding? Those are the questions the research is seeding. And the author is explicit that future generations will complete the work that this discovery begins.
So when you step back from everything we have covered today, the chess metaphor, the Morrigan, the Bryn Cethlethi pattern stone, the Dama de Elche, the Arabian regalia, the burning bush, what is the through line? What is the thing that connects all of it?
The through line is this. Our most remote ancestors developed a method for encoding complex information, political, geographical, constitutional, cosmological, in visual compositions governed by strict rules of syntax. Color was one of those rules. It was not decoration. It was grammar. And the loss of that grammar, through oxidation, through degradation, through centuries of scholarship that did not know to look for it, is a loss we are only now beginning to measure.
And the research is the beginning of that measurement.
A prospective beginning. The author is scrupulous about that framing. This is not a conclusion. It is a demonstration of the importance of the narratives emerging from the iconographic record. It is an alert. Here is what color was doing. Here is how much of it we have lost. Here is why it matters. Now, go and look.
Here is what this really comes down to, I think. We have spent this episode talking about a writing system that encoded the structure of entire civilizations in visual compositions. And colour was the layer of that system that told you not just what something was, but what it meant in relation to everything around it. Black and white were not opposites. They were a sequence, a protocol, an order of deference that governed how land was allocated, how decisions were made, how war was sanctioned, and how a prince became a king.
And the reason this matters now, practically, not just academically, is that there are hundreds of millions of artifacts in the world's museums. The majority of them, the research suggests, will have iconographic significance. Every one of them is a potential document. Every surviving fragment of pigment is a potential adjective waiting to be read. The research is asking for a generation of scholars to pick up the question and carry it forward.
And for the rest of us, for anyone who has ever played chess, or stood in front of an ancient artifact in a museum, or looked at the gold border on a piece of Arabian regalia and assumed it was decorative, the invitation is simpler. Ask the question the observant prince asked. Why do the squares alternate? Why this colour and not another? What is this colour modifying?
Because the answer, if the research is correct, is not aesthetic. It is constitutional. It is geographical. It is a fragment of a language spoken globally for tens of thousands of years, hiding in plain sight on every chessboard, every museum shelf, every embroidered robe, waiting for someone to ask the right question.
The next time you sit down at a chessboard, and I genuinely mean this, you are not sitting down to a game. You are sitting down to a surviving fragment of a global visual language, one in which the colour of every square once carried legal, political, and cosmological meaning. The adjectives have mostly been erased, but the nouns are still there, and the research of an unknown soldier is asking us, all of us, to start reading again. That is where we will leave it today.